Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Francis Odum. Francis, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks. Good to be with you as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat, but for folks that don't know you, before we dive into the whole AppSec conversation, who is Francis and what are you up to in your career at the moment?
Yeah. My name is Francis. I've primarily been within the technology industry, give or take, over the last 7 years. Spent my time in data analytics. Spent some time in venture capital, as well as also just running my own startup. And then as of today, right now, primarily a cybersecurity researcher. So I do three major things. I'm an instructor, so I do teach people cybersecurity technologies. Number two, I do a lot of consulting with startups as well as like invest in firms. And then lastly, a huge part of what I do is just cybersecurity research. So diving into new markets, new technologies, new vendors, and evaluating how new categories have been evolving. So yeah, that's a lot of what I do. And yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to chat and I'm excited to collaborate. I've been following your newsletter. For folks that don't know of your newsletter, it's the software analyst newsletter. I've been following that and seeing some of your industry analysis around different categories and tools and vendors and kind of industry trends. And I said, hey, why don't we collaborate on something here? And that's what brought us to this, this piece that we're going to be walking through today, which is the rise of application security posture management platforms. Before we kind of start doing a deep dive into the topic and some of the things we focused on, themes and so on, what was kind of, the motivation to want to focus on this topic? What are some, kind of things that, top of mind? Why is this a hot topic for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think number one, so one thing I do as a cybersecurity researcher is I dive into a lot of different markets. So not just application security or software supply chain or cloud security. I do a variety of markets, and I think at certain times you start to see convergences happening between a variety of different markets. And I think in this case, and me and Chris came together where we realized I did some work early on this year on just vulnerability management and some of the more legacy vendors there. I also looked at some work as well in application security as well and started to see that, hey, there was some convergence within these markets. And obviously, Chris is like one of the best names in vulnerability management as well as software supply chain industry. And obviously, he's got an amazing book, which, by the way, if you're going to be an RSA, make sure you pick up a copy of it. But yeah. So anyways, I reached out to Chris and I was like, hey, you know what? This is a topic you know quite well as well. I'm also real. I'm seeing a lot of this convergence is happening. How about we come together? And I think as we came together, started to do our research, we started to realize all of this was wrapping up into this category called ASPM, which we're gonna dive into a little bit more. But yeah, that was a little bit of the inspiration. We'd also want to hear from you, Chris, too. Like,
Yeah.
your
Yeah, I mean,
take.
I've been, digging into these topics very deeply the last several years, around application security, software supply chain security, vulnerability management. And, we've seen kind of this common theme from the industry that there's just simply a lot of complexity and things to try to manage. We've heard phrases like from code to cloud. We have infrastructure as code, cloud native environments, hybrid cloud environments, kind of the explosion of vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities in the ecosystem, different cloud security vendors and different tools that we're seeing, trying to kind of tackle this problem from a lot of different angles. And now we're seeing this convergence of trying to bring all these things together into what's, called an ASPM, Application Security Posture Management Platform. And it reminds me of early days of, say, cloud security, for example, where we saw CSPM and CWPP and CNAP, and now, all the acronyms, right, of these tools converging and things coming together, folks trying to make sense of disparate tools and different insights and, kind of have a comprehensive visibility of what's going on. So I really like how you laid it out here in the ASPM landscape. So if you would, kind of walk us through a little bit of, not every company, obviously, or any, particular company, but just kind of the areas. Like you see full ASPM platforms, you have some cloud vulnerability management, AppSec, cloud security, application security tooling testing, what made you break it out this way? And, how do you think these things are all converging now into these ASPM platforms?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe first of all, I mean, we could first of all start off with a conversation on just what's happened over the last couple of years in terms of like the industry and kind of a lot of this market. What have we actually noticed over the last few years? And I think as you mentioned, the first innovation that obviously happened was with the likes of Sneak, where there was this, if you want to call it, a convergence or the coming together of developers and security teams as well as the operations team into this whole notion of called the DevSecOps. I think so that we started to see a lot of those, and obviously companies like Sneak obviously helped us realize that, and this whole concept of shifting left started. And then what we had was the evolution of a lot of scanning tools, so the rise of SaaS tools that really helped us like try to find those vulnerabilities really, really early on into the process. And so that happened, obviously, and this was also happening during the time where lots of companies were obviously moving to the cloud as well, and moving into more cloud native environments. And I think over time, as more tools and solutions, and we've had secret detection tools, we have so many other types of scanning technologies that have evolved over the last few years. What we started to realize is most security teams now are getting bombarded with lots of tools. There's a tool sprawl, right? There are lots of alerts being generated, and this is also together with lots of your other traditional vulnerability management solutions, like whether you're talking with Rapid7 or Tenable and the like. And I think what we have now, where we're currently at, that's leading us into ASPM, which we're going to talk about in a couple moment, is like we have a huge tool sprawl. The promise of trying to bring DevSecOps and bringing teams together has actually unfortunately resulted into more silos. And we're having a lot more silos, a lot more tools sprawl. And I think what's happened over the last few years now is like companies and solutions and really the industry is like, how do we aggregate and put all of these tools together? And so the first iteration of this industry was what we call application vulnerability correlation. So how do you try to, this was like maybe 2016. And the whole notion with that was, hey, how do we go about bringing together, correlating lots of alerts across all of our different security tools? And so that was the first iteration of trying to bring things together. And then we gradually moved into application security testing orchestration. So now how do we also incorporate a lot more of our application security testing tools together? And then we moved into ASOC, which is a little bit more closer at hand than many people. This is application security orchestration and correlation tools, where it's like, okay, we're bringing all our AST tools together with some of our vulnerability tools. How do we make sure we try to simultaneous and have all of this? But the challenge even with ASOC, and that takes us to ASPM, is with ASOC is still, you're still having so many, everything's correlated, but you don't have a centralized management control in which you could actually see all of the different threats, all your alerts from one screen, and then be able to actively respond. And I think that's what's led us towards right now, where we have this application security posture management, ASPM, where it's pretty much just, you could call it like, it allows us to have visibility, so across all the tools, detection capabilities, correlation, prioritization, and then most importantly, remediation of those security vulnerabilities. This could be auto remediation or a reduction in alerts for security teams. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think we've gone from an industry of application vulnerability correlation to application security orchestration. We moved to ASOC, and now we're at this point in ASPM. And later on, we could talk about some of the vendors and what they're doing. But
Yeah.
I'd love to get you.
Yeah. Yeah, from my perspective, you said a lot of things that resonated, and also, I've seen similar trends in the industry. Is like we've seen obviously the adoption of cloud has grown quite significantly. So people are worrying about cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud environments, and have security tools to kind of monitor the posture and configuration, misconfiguration, and risks of these environments. And then we've seen the kind of correlated push for DevOps and now DevSecOps. Shift left. Got to bring security left earlier in the SDLC and so on. It led to kind of this proliferation of SaaS and DaaS and secret scanning, infrastructure as code scanning, container scanning, you name it, right? The tools. So we did shift left, but the challenge there is we've shifted, a lot of noise left. These tools are all producing findings, things that people need to now go and investigate to determine is it a false positive? Does it pose a significant risk? What are the concerns around these? And then trying to bring all those findings from all those security tools and scanners together to some kind of comprehensive solution is also a very problematic and challenging thing in here. I think you have a great, I think you have a great demonstration of this in a visualization that I'm going to jump to real quick here. You see here, from Lachiotech, they show kind of this types of tooling that we've seen: infrastructure as code, containers, DAS, CSPM, et cetera. And people are looking at ways to implement these tools, whether they're using open source tools that are out there, using commercial vendor tools, and then kind of bringing this all together in the vulnerability aggregation. Bringing it all together to make some kind of sense of it all, right?
Exactly.
And we've seen some of the challenges with these tools, just the sprawling of tools and all the findings that they produce. Is that actually, in the ironic part about this is like DevSecOps was supposed to kind of break down silos between development, security, and operations, but by shifting all this noise left and often implementing gates around deploying to production and things like that, we've kind of bolstered those silos because now people have to go and dig through all these findings, dig through things with security teams and say, hey, this is a false positive, or hey, this isn't a known exploited vulnerability, et cetera. And that's caused a lot of challenges for teams out there. So I did want to jump to another thing that we dive into in the article too, which is, what are some of the pain points traditionally associated with vulnerability management? And I kind of covered a good bit of this piece, a good bit of this topic in the piece that we do here. And so I'll step through some of these things here that we found, in our report here. Is like, first off, is just the explosion of vulnerabilities and alerts. I pulled some research, from folks like Jerry Gamblin, who's a researcher, a vulnerability researcher, and he showed the explosive growth of known vulnerabilities. If you think about, CVEs, common vulnerabilities enumerations that are captured in the NIST National Vulnerability Database, for example, that number has grown tremendously. You look at some of the figures here, 28,000, I think it was in 2023, pretty significant year-over-year growth. I think it's now 200,000 plus known vulnerabilities just in this database, not counting OSS Index or OSV and like all the other vulnerability databases, which you now also need to be looking at, especially with some of the problems going around with NVD, where the vulnerability data is not being enriched and updated in a timely fashion. So now you're using other additional, kind of vulnerability databases. So your tools need to account for that too. And historically, we've kind of taken an approach of, prioritizing vulnerabilities around things like common vulnerability scoring system, severity scores of critical, high, medium, low, et cetera. But the challenge there is like, research is showing that less than 5% of those are ever actually exploited on an annual basis. So you might be prioritizing a high finding or a critical finding based on CVSS, but it's not actually known to be exploited. Or it's not likely to be exploited, for example, or it's not even reachable, right? For example, so it's something else we talk about in the article. So now development teams, engineering teams are kind of going and toiling through all the findings, the alerts and findings that we're seeing. And I pulled some other research here from Scientia, which is another organization that does a lot of amazing, research around cybersecurity. And they show that the average organization has roughly about like a 10% remediation rate. So say, you receive, I think they showed 10 to 20%, I think is the figures they had, where say you have like, five teams can only remediate 1 out of every 5 new vulnerabilities a month. Say you have, thousands or several hundred at least coming in on a monthly basis, and you're only able to remediate, the 1 out of every 5. That vulnerability backlog is building up exponentially. And there's some research I cite in here from organizations like Brazilian and Ponemon, who show that the average organization have hundreds of thousands to even millions of vulnerabilities in their vulnerability backlog that they're trying to burn down. So, this is a massive amount of like security technical debt that people have essentially accumulated. And, they're trying to not only go burn that debt down and work with product teams and get, prioritization to actually get these things fixed. But then they're also watching all the new vulnerabilities that continue to come in on a monthly basis. So it's just burying them basically. And something else I'll call out real quick here is like, a few other things we cite is, Qualys, major vulnerability, tool out there, platform used by, many people around the world, leading vendor in this space. They show that basically the malicious actors, their ability to, weaponize known exploit or known vulnerability, for example, outpaces our ability to defend it by, I think it's like 11.1 days, it says here. So think about that. So you have a known vulnerability, they're exploiting it faster than we can fix it, and we're accumulating these to hundreds of thousands and millions of them in a backlog. So there's just a lot of known vulnerabilities, known risk out there that are essentially just sitting around waiting to be exploited. And then, the reason that's relevant too is I cite again some research here. It talks about the vintage vulnerabilities, as they call it. So it's not just like the 0 day or the latest, oh, we got to patch this thing that just came out. They're going in, they're exploiting these vintage vulnerabilities that are just sitting in these backlogs. with known vulnerabilities that are out there just waiting to be exploited. So that's another thing we call out in the report here as well. So, we've talked a little bit about DevSecOps and AppSec and things like that are driving some of these changes, and we're starting to hear, like we said, a lot about application security posture management. I wanted to see from your perspective, Francis, and I think you touched on this in the article, was, how do you even go about defining ASPM? And I think you touched on it in this part of the article, if I'm not mistaken. What exactly is ASPM? What is it trying to achieve? What are we after here?
Yeah, for sure. And just to come back to some of the points that you mentioned, I would say you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct in the sense of, yes, we need to be very aware that, yes, very, very, as much as all these vulnerabilities are exploding within the industry right now, yes, I think the point that really you mentioned that really stuck out to me is just less than 10% are actually being dealt with in that backlog. And so when you think about how what the consequences are for an enterprise, only 10%, I mean, that just shows just how many organizations are in a really vulnerable state. And I think that's a major industry I wanted to highlight. And then the other thing you mentioned was even more around it was primarily also around the fact that the national, like the CVEs and some of these MVDD databases are not updated in real time as well. So I think that's another thing that we're noticing that some leaders are complaining about in the industry. And so yeah, this is a very, very it's a very interesting category, and it's definitely something CISOs and security leaders and AppSec teams are dealing with, and it's very important that we highlight it. So thanks for that. But yeah, no, back to the point about ASPM, and kind of like what do we define ASPM? As I kind of mentioned early on, we talked about how we evolved from this application security orchestration and correlation tools towards ASPM. And I think ASPM as we know it today, and kind of what I said, as I mentioned early on, is all about, I kind of like to think about it in like 4 to 5 major components that really define what an ASPM provider does. Is it's all about how do you go about getting good visibility, detection, correlation, prioritization, and most importantly, the remediation component of security vulnerabilities across your whole software development lifecycle. This is from code all the way to cloud. And I think where ASOC platforms didn't do a good job, and why we had this more the posture management side of things is more around the remediation side that you talked about, right? Like that was a big part whereby, yes, maybe now you have really good visibility into all the vulnerabilities across your SDLC, but it's like, how do you go about fixing those? And how do you go about even having a good sense of prioritization of like this risks, as you mentioned, like what's reachable, what's not reachable, what's transitive, and like what are the most important. So I think that's a major component. But yeah, in general, ASPM, I mean, the goal with an A in very easy language, and shout out to James, who we know again, and I even quoted him in the piece, but it pretty much just tells you the story of, how your code reaches to production, right? So from code all the way to deployment, it tells you, gives you really good visibility into who pushed this code, who compiled this, these are the vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. This is how you actually go about managing it. And then this is how you go about remediation. So those are some really basic ways. The other thing we could talk about with ASPM is in terms of the market solutions and vendors on the market today. I think there are a variety of different ways in which companies are actually going about solving this problem of ASPM. There's not like one shot solution, right? And I think from the research that we did and talking to researchers and vendors in the ecosystem, I think there are like majorly 3 ways, if you want to call it, that we're seeing lots of vendors involved. So you have some ASPM providers who have their own proprietary and native scanners. So all of the components of your code, so that could be your SaaS tools, your secret scanning tools. This could be IAC, container, Dast, and all of those components you need on the code on the left side of the stack. You have some vendors who proprietarily build all of that in-house, and they have their own scanners. And then they do that all the way closer to the CSPM towards as you get towards more the cloud side. You have a second variety of vendors as well who you could also say they also have some of their own proprietary scanners along ASD solutions. and into cloud, but they still use some component of open source tools as well to help them. They have like an open source wrapper that they actually use to provide lots of those code and shift left components. And then I think the final part, and also another side we really like as well too, is just even more, you want to call them the orchestrators, or you want to call them vulnerability aggregators. And a huge part of what we talk about in the piece, because we talk about this vulnerability piece, but the fact that like there's some vendors like Armor Code, for example, who they're extremely good on the vulnerability management side of things in terms of like prioritizing and how you go about um, aggregating and managing all of the risk component. But then they also help you aggregate. So if a company is using a like Sneak SCA, using a SemGrip SAST, or like using a variety of tools, they help you orchestrate and put all of those together, and then give you like this single pane of glass to help you manage that. And then even using things like AI now to go about the remediation. So those are like the three categories of vendors we serve. But happy to
Yeah,
also.
I was gonna jump in here a little bit. So I think that there's, interesting perspective in these two different approaches. Some organizations, as you point out, kind of like doing it from a proprietary or commercial perspective of going out and trying to build all these features and capabilities natively, and provide them, directly from their product, for example, of this robust, different types of scan, aggregation, enrichment, contextualization, and so on. And then you have others who are taking more of an orchestration approach. And I think that that's an interesting dichotomy because on one hand, it may be convenient to just work with one vendor that does all the things, right? But on the other, you want to have best of breed solutions. You want to bring different tools together from different vendors, and having that orchestration type approach could be very valuable to some organizations that prefer that type of approach as well. And I think that there's a lot of parallels here with what we're seeing with broader industry trends. Like I know it's been a hot topic lately around platformization, or however you would phrase that, right? Everyone's now a platform company, right? They're doing lots of different things, and it's because various reasons. Often we know that security tools are, organizations are overwhelmed with the number of security tools that they're managing, whether open source tools, proprietary tools, often a hybrid thereof. They may be facing economic or financial budgetary constraints. So they're trying to consolidate tools and consolidate licensing and spend and so on. Then maybe that's driving them towards a platform. And then obviously there's the perspective from the platform provider in terms of total addressable market. The more comprehensive and robust their platform is, the more broader of a market they can reach for different features and functionalities of said platform. So I think that that's driving some of those factors too. And I know we dove into some of the examples, like Armor Code is one that you highlighted there, for example, around ASPM and some of the things they do, both from an ASPM perspective, software supply chain, security, risk-based vulnerability management, bringing some of the DevSecOps methodologies and tools together, and even some compliance aspects as well. So I don't know if you want to, touch a little bit more on Armor Code, and then we'll jump down. We actually mentioned some other vendors that I think, worth giving a kind of a highlight or a shout out to as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, and I think we I'm a code. I think one thing we as we talked about was this. They already had this risk-based vulnerability management component to them that's really helping you deal with all that volume of alerts and like backlog, and how you go about actually prioritizing that, as well as the security posture management. And I think for them, one thing I think we learned just from even assessing them was just they have this vulnerability prioritization and risk scoring engine, because as we mentioned, you're getting thousands and hundreds of alerts, but it's like, how do you actually go about prioritizing that? What are the most important ones that you actually need to go about actually fixing? What are actually exploitable, and or like relating to your business in terms of like business criticality? How do you go about actually prioritizing this? And I think that was one of the biggest benefit that we found, is that they had this really risk-based approach of correlating lots of data from a wide variety, and they have like over 300 or no to over 200 and 200 plus integrations, which is pretty quite comprehensive, and they just help customers visualize and report on all of this. So that was one piece there, and I think so they're doing a really good job, and they have a lot of features around automation and just AI powered correlation. And so yeah, that was a vendor, but we go into a lot of depth in the report. So yeah, people could feel free to read a lot more about them. But yeah, that was a solution that we thought. And as you mentioned, I think one last thing to highlight is the fact that some companies prefer to have their own best of breed solutions, right? Developers are very much all about like, this is what we like you don't have to push anything on us. And so in their case, they're just like, okay, your company, your developer, your AppSec teams, they know what's best. And we're just going to come in and help you aggregate all of those, prioritize, and then use a lot of our AI capabilities and risk scoring engine to help you deal with tickets, escalation and notification and the likes. And they've done quite well with lots of big Fortune 500. They're one of the more established players within the space. But yeah, happy to.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty comprehensive coverage of them in the article. Definitely worth checking out and seeing how they're tackling this problem. What kind of unique features, capabilities, and perspective they're bringing. And then we highlighted some other companies. I just want to give a bit of a shout out to for folks to check out. Doing some different activities in this space. They're definitely related. One of whom that came to mind for me was Avalar. It's kind of a data fabric for security. And if you're not familiar with that concept, I actually cite an article from Darwin Salazar. If you haven't checked out that article, it's called Security Data Fabric Explained. And he talks about why Zscaler actually just recently acquired that company for $350 million. So pretty hefty price tag, right? They see some promise there, some opportunity. And it's interesting, they kind of bring this perspective of bringing all the telemetry, all the insight together from your organizational context, your endpoints, all the things in your environment around vulnerabilities, and having that context of what's going on in the ecosystem, in the enterprise, in the environment. So definitely recommend checking that out. Another one I gave a bit of a shout out to is one of the RSA Innovation Sandbox companies called VulnCheck. We talked about earlier, things like CISA known exploited vulnerability catalog. VulnCheck has actually produced what they call VulnCheck Kev. So they took Kev and they built on that and have even more known exploited vulnerabilities based on some proprietary and internal activities that they're doing, or commercial vulnerability intelligence that they're going out and finding other things that have been exploited. And they're also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, pulling in some insights from other vulnerability databases beyond just NVD, for example, OSV and OSS Index and others, I think. But definitely recommend giving that a look. We had some companies in there like Endor Labs, who are kind of a more modern software composition analysis innovative company that's looking at like, how do you make better risk-informed selection of open source software components? How do you prioritize vulnerabilities that are actually reachable? Because we talked about drowning in the vulnerabilities. And then obviously Sneak, you can't have this conversation without mentioning the giant in the room of Sneak, who's kind of pioneered a lot of these places of bringing these tools and capabilities together towards kind of that comprehensive platform type approach that you've talked about, through a combination, I think in their case, of organic development, maybe acquisitions, things like that as well. We're seeing Wiz, for example, follow a similar route, starting to natively organically develop some things, but also go out now and start to acquire some other vendors. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in application security, I definitely recommend giving this piece a read. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Francis.
And then yeah, absolutely. I totally agree on all of those vendors. And I think the other side of things too is just, some vendors have just said, hey, you know what, we're gonna build all of our own tool. And we're just gonna have all of our own proprietary solutions. So I think we also want to just mention like companies like Cycode, obviously, who they just have their own fully built in ASPM. As well as they also have some orchestration capabilities too with their Connector X. Connector X that also helps to perform a little bit of those connectors. But again, it kind of comes back to this ultimate debate in cybersecurity of best of breed versus platform approach, right? So some people are just going to build their orchestrations and aggregators. And you have companies like obviously what Armor Code, but some companies are going like, you know what, we're going to provide you the whole full suite of our own proprietary and give you like this platform approach. And I think companies like obviously Cycode are doing the same thing with their risk intelligence graph, as well as just the whole platform, which I go into a lot more detail, as well as the connector X that helps with integrating of third-party tools. Another, maybe a few ones we don't need to go into a lot of depth, is just things like Ox. We've heard of Ox, we've heard of Legit Security too. Some of those vendors too as well too. They have some of their own proprietary scanners, but they're also integrating with lots of open source tools. And then you have some generic AppSec companies too in the industry too, like up and coming companies, like as we kind of mentioned with Endo Labs, focused on reachability. There's a company also like Backlash. They do a lot of work in reachability analysis. There are a number of a couple of other vendors, JIT too. They also do a lot of the work around orchestration and integrations. SideGenie on the AppSec side. So there are a number of other companies, StockLog too. I think we were chatting about StockLog too, on how they're built around a couple of open source too. But those are some of the vendors that we did research. But yeah, everyone is coming at the problem from a different perspective and angle and solving for customers. And at the end of the day, I think it's just based off what an enterprise needs, that you go. And then one last thing I'll say is on the really lower side, because I think a lot of the solutions we talked about works on the mid-market and larger enterprises. And I think for more nimble startups teams, we're hearing a lot about companies like Aikido, that like provide a little bit of this ASPM capabilities, but more so for really small and really nimble startups as well. So yeah, everyone's coming at it from a different place. And then we haven't even talked about the really big guys like CrowdStrike acquiring Bionic, right? Which is a little bit of that, or SIDA with Palo Alto Networks and some of those guys. So it's going to be an interesting space, but we think this is going to be the category that defines this cloud and application security or software security over the next few years, and it's something for people to watch.
Yeah, definitely agree with you. I was happy to collaborate on it with you. And I think these trends of cloud, DevSecOps, vulnerability, kind of explosion, the complexity of the modern environment ecosystem, making sense of it all, bringing all these different disparate, tools and functionalities together is really interesting. And I think we're in for some exciting times in this category. So that said, the article again is called The Rise of Application Security Posture Management Platforms by myself and Francis Odum. Francis, thanks so much for joining me, man. And thanks to everyone who tuned in today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me as well. And yes, it was a privilege. It was a privilege working with you on this piece. And yeah, so for anyone, feel free to go. We both have it on both of our blogs, so feel free to read deeper into them. As well as we also have lots of other things that we've done in the ecosystem. So like Chris has his book on. Maybe you could talk very briefly on what you have in the vulnerability management book you have and how some of that connects to what we wrote.
Yeah, sure. I just published a book with Wiley called Effective Vulnerability Management. It actually is out now. If you grab a copy, you can get one, delivered relatively quickly via Amazon. But we opened the book just discussing the proliferation of software, powering everything from consumer goods to critical infrastructure to, economic prosperity and national security weapon systems and so on. And, how the vulnerability landscape has changed and the complexity of cloud and DevOps and DevSecOps and trying to shift left and all the tooling that we just walked through and talked about. So the book covers all of that. And then we also dive into some things that we didn't touch on in the article here, thanks to one of my co-authors, Nikki Robinson, who has a doctoral degree in human factors in cybersecurity. So she comes at it from the angle of the human perspective of cognitive overload of all the tools and all the findings and the psychological aspect of that we're dealing with when we think about vulnerability management too, which is often an overlooked topic. And then I dedicated a chapter in the book to secure by design because we're seeing a push, for secure by design. There's one thing to be said about getting better at, kind of playing whack-a-mole of fixing all the vulnerabilities, but they just keep coming faster and faster. We're now seeing this push for secure by design software and systems and products that's being championed by folks like CISO, for example, and Jen Easterly and others there. It's actually been mentioned, by them quite a bit. It's been mentioned, I think, in the latest U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy as well. So I touch on that throughout the chapter of what does it mean to be secure by design? What are some things we can look at? Examples, for example, pulling from like NIST Secure Software Development Framework. And, we close out the book of looking at the future and also talking about, what are some steps to put together a comprehensive vulnerability management program, which includes a lot of things that we just talked about today. So I appreciate that shout out. And yeah, hopefully everyone enjoys the article. I'll be sure to drop a link to the article in our live stream here, and you'll find it in both on his software analyst newsletter on Substack as well as my Resilient Cyber Substack. So be sure to check it out, and hope everyone has a good afternoon.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. Bye.